Hello and welcome back, and today we're continuing looking at Plex Media Server and network attached storage, and today it's the turn of the brand new Asustor LockerStor. Now, we are primarily looking at the LockerStor 4 today, but it's worth highlighting that pretty much everything you're going to see today applies to both the LockerStor 2 and the LockerStor 4, with a very similar hardware makeup and architecture between them, simply that one is a 2-bay, one is a 4-bay. They both arrive with the same great CPU inside, and they both arrive with some great performance extras built in. Now, if we have a look at this system, we can go into the hardware settings. We can find out more information about it, hopefully find out where the settings are on this device. And we can find out more information about this system, and ultimately whether this device is right for you and Plex Media Server. We're utilising an Intel Celeron processor, it's the J4125, that we've utilised in a couple of other NAS tests in the past, and 4 gig of memory. We're utilising inside traditional media, and my favourite of all, we are of course using hardware transcoding. This CPU involves embedded graphics and supports 1080p and 4K. We're using Plex Media Server, and we're using Plex Media Server 1.20, a very recent version of Plex that's already available in the Asustor App Center. I'm going to do a full overview of this software. It should already have gone live before this video, I believe, but if it hasn't, it'll be with you very soon. And I've already opened up Plex. There's the IP, and here's the IP Plex is on. Now, I've already loaded this with media. Much like my other tests, we're going to be looking at 720p, 1080p, and then we're going to go into the advanced 4K and 1080p high bitrate media. Now, utilizing this architecture so far, I'll be interested to see if it can hit 4K, but very few NAS devices, and I really do mean very few, with this hardware architecture have been able to hit 4K transcoding in Plex. So maybe the Asustor will be the one that turns it around. With this server, I should also highlight, if we go into the settings, we'll be able to see that I have got hardware transcoding. It's the latest version of Plex right there. If we go into the transcoder option, we can see that I've set it to make my CPU hurt. This is a Plex pass, and therefore we're able to take advantage of hardware transcoding. And also, hopefully on screen, you can see the NAS running there in the background with its own individual CPU and memory utilization. Mainly we're looking at CPU utilization today, because this has got 4 gig of memory, which should be more than enough for pretty much all of the tests that we're running today. Also, this system does involve SSD caching as an option, which you can enable to improve your performance further, but we haven't enabled that in today's test. So first and foremost, let's have a look at a 720p file. We're going to use the same files that we use in all of our tests. So if we go into the matrix, we can see this is a 720p H.264 file. It's a full movie, and again, if you haven't seen it before, spoiler alert, but for God's sake, it's 1999. Let's go ahead and play this file. While this plays, I'll leave the settings on screen where possible, just to give you guys some idea about what the settings are with regards to playback. And I'm going to mute the audio because of the YouTube AI content bots and how they'll just rip these videos apart. But throughout the course of this video, we're going to do several things. And on this 720p file, it should be very easy to show you them. First and foremost, we're going to keep flicking around files. We're going to show that even though we are streaming a file over the network from a NAS over Plex at 720p, for example, we can flick and do whatever the hell we like. This file is going to play. Now, that is the first part. The second part is called transcoding, and that is when we're going to take a file and reshape it and rejig it and ultimately change it into a different version, which may be more befitting to an older mobile, an older TV, maybe on a metered data connection. So for now, we're going to switch this 720p file down to 480p. And that was a near enough instantaneous change there. And again, you'll have to look at the screen to tell the difference in resolution, but this is now running at 480p. I can't see the resource utilization. Maybe I'll open it up here on screen for me, but you should be able to see it there in post-production afterwards, how much CPU resources we're using. And if we flick from a 480 file all the way down to a crucially tiny 160p, we can have a look. It's going to take an extra few seconds to work out that conversion. and this CPU should allow us to transcode down. But it's worth highlighting that this, as a jump, is pretty substantial. We're asking the system to, on the fly, convert a giant 720p file into a simple 160p. I know YouTube do it, but YouTube use a lot more powerful assets than Asustor have got in this NAS, and unfortunately it does look like the 720 conversion down to a 160 has not been completely successful. Let's scale it up and go to a 240p. We'll see if any buffering happens here in the background. If we have a look at the resources, we can see there was a CPU jump there on my side, and I'm sure you've seen it there on screen live. But if we let it go to the Plex automatic conversion, where it analyzes your available settings, it will then see what's the best settings for you. But it does look like it has hung the tiniest bit here. So let's try that again, and this time we're going to try it with those same conversion settings that we just discussed, but this time on a fresh conversion. So again, down to 240p. And no, it has not been successful for that conversion. It would seemingly seem that the CPU inside this NAS is not liking this particular conversion. So next we move over to a 1080p file. We're going to go back into Little Shop of Horrors, and again H.264, a 1080p file, and we're going to go ahead and play that. It should play straight away first time, and again we should be able to convert through at the original quality, nice and simple. And again, for those of you that wish to highlight it, I will say this is being utilized over the network. This is not a remote access endeavor. This test is not about testing internet access, although conversion and transcoding are an important part of internet access, particularly if you're on metered connections, and again on smaller devices like mobiles, where watching a 1080p file is just overkill, both in terms of the size of the file, the data you're transmitting, and the strength of your internet being pushed. So there you go, the 1080p file seemingly worked absolutely fine. We're going to move that down now to 720p, and again 720p seemingly worked absolutely fine, with the buffering there happening very, very quickly indeed. So again, we're seeing those higher access speeds going absolutely fine there, but once again we're going to make that switch now down to the lower 480p. Actually no, that was the wrong one there. We want to go to 480p. And again, we are seemingly hitting that wall again. Now, this isn't the first time we've seen 480p down-coded transcode actions having this effect. So it isn't a huge surprise. I just didn't think we would hit it this early. The fact that this system can play 1080p and 720p beautifully for streaming purposes, absolutely fine. It's still a tremendous boon. But that transcoding engine, I would have liked to have seen a little bit more activity from that. So now we're going to make our way into the more dense test area. We're going to look at between 300 and 400 megabits per second test files. Now these are dense. These range from as little as a couple of hundred meg all the way down here to a 1.4 gigabyte test file. All of them are 30 seconds long. Now that's important. That means as you go to the denser file type, it is a heavier file, which means that the transcoding action or the playback and the handling of that file has to be done faster than, or at least as fast as, the playing of the file. Otherwise, the playback of the file will be quicker than the system being able to change it. For example, this 3 megabit H.264 should play absolutely fine, and indeed it does. It runs absolutely fine. We can skip forward, we can skip back, and you can see the buffering is fine. Now, as we go into these denser tests, you are going to hear that fan from this editing laptop getting louder and louder, so I do apologise for that noise there in the background. It's very hard to control that in this close proximity. But next, we're going to downscale that, and again we're going to go down to the 480p. I'm going to move the mic because I do believe that mic is getting way too close there, but as you see, it couldn't even attempt that file. It kicked us out straight away, and that's not a good sign. Next, the Hevc file. Now this, commonly known as H.265, if if we go into the conversion settings, you'll see that we haven't had to prompt the system to convert this file. That's not uncommon. The H.265 is generally more and more becoming a licensing and prohibitive issue to hardware manufacturers and particularly multimedia providers, with a lot of third-party companies stepping in with plugins and add-ons and services to bolt on to existing first-party providers and improve things. Now, this CPU, it should be said, does have one issue that we have noticed before from other providers. It's nothing to do with the provider itself. We're seeing their pixelation already. The issue is to do with the graphics driver. We've noticed this on other NAS platforms, and I'm willing to bet this is the case for the Asustor as well, with Plex choosing by default a driver that is not optimally suited to H.265, as you see there. For example, if we go to this 10 megabit H.264, so this is technically a heavier file than the one that we just played, you see here that it is playing absolutely fine. However, the minute we go to this same file, so again, that was 10 megabits per second H.264, the older and, dare I say, less efficient compression technique. If we go back to the HEVC or H.265 10-bit or HDR, and we play that file, we see buffering, but it's nowhere near as quick. And that is to do with the fact the system is forced to transcode. And as you see, we're seeing a lot of pixelation. And a lot of that is to do with Plex Media Server itself. It's not to do with Asustor and the NAS platform. This CPU has, by default, a much better driver than the one that's being recommended by the Plex system. And I will be doing a follow-up video to show you guys how to force Plex to use the right driver. But we have to use the default setup here for this test. Now, if we move into the 30 megabits, we are now going into a much heavier file. But again, because it's H.264, it plays like a dream. And again, this is much heavier. You can hear my laptop starting to ramp up there. But ultimately, we are getting great performance there overall, and the file's running fine. It's just going to be just like before if we go into that transcoding settings with Plex and the driver it's choosing to use, just for me not being suitable. The CPU inside this Asustor NAS can do so much more with both the Asustor software and generally in terms of transcoding. It's just Plex forces the driver it used. Do check out my video on the Plex fix that we did before. Now, if we go into 4K territory, and again, we're going to carry on with H.264 just that little bit longer, but this is where we're going to start to see a little bit of struggle. We see it's going to play back the original file, and this is a 4K version of it in H.264, but as you see, the buffering there has ceased, and this is because of that driver once again. We leave it there, and it's not going to move forward, and I do believe even if it did start playing, there is no way playback would not overwrite the buffering and the caching there happening in the background. As you see, it's kicked us out, and that's going to be pretty much the growing trend. If we go for the 200 megabits per second 4K UHD H.264 file, we're seeing the buffering, but again, we hit that buffer wall at 5 seconds, and it's not going to play that file. So once again, what we need to analyze here is Plex and that driver. Now, to date, I don't know how to get into the back end of Asustor's own command line there. Normally you can get in with SSL, but if we go into the file explorer here, when we go into Plex, go into the library, Plex Media Server, we find the preferences tab, and from there we will need to open that and re-upload that file. So if we open up that XML, you need to find out the transcoder quality, and we need to insert that driver here. But without wanting to play around with these settings too much, it would be remiss of us to mess around and eventually break our Plex Media Server setting. But for now, as a default setting, until I get that driver fix resolved, I wouldn't recommend utilizing this system currently beyond H.264 in Plex. Now, natively is a very, very different story. If you utilize the Asustor applications for multimedia playback generally and using their own first-party apps, you will see a very, very different story. Their own multimedia application takes advantage of all of those settings far, far more easy, and particularly those with regard to transcoding with playback. Now, they have their own applications, as you see. They've got lots and lots of multimedia apps there that we can install. But in terms of Plex Media Server, for now, I would steer away from Plex on this platform until we have got that graphical fix in place. And again, I recommend you check out my articles on Plex fixes with that driver, because this CPU can do so much more than Plex is giving it a chance to do. And this is no fault of Asustor. If we go back in, remember, this was able to play pretty much all of our higher end files. If we go back to the films there, we can go ahead and play another dense file there. We've got the Hateful Eight again. This 720p file, we can click around nice and easily. It's playing absolutely fine over the network. It can manage H.264 without transcoding. It's just when that GPU embedded on the CPU is required, Plex for some reason doesn't want to know, and that fix will hopefully fix it. But this has been my testing of Plex Media Server on the brand new LockerStor series. I will be doing a follow-up video to this utilizing their own first-party software, and I promise I will have a video very shortly that shows you how to fix the driver conflict between Plex using its own driver and forcing Plex to use the default driver that the CPU on this NAS, that CPU, the J4125, can utilize. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope you guys have found this video helpful. Do let me know what you think. Click like if you enjoyed the video. Click subscribe to learn more. Visit me over at NAS Compares for more updates on the great range from Asustor and other NAS brands too, of course. And do visit span.com to buy your NAS today. Otherwise, I will catch you next time. See you later.